Welcome back to Hope Tales, where real-life aviation miracles remind us that courage, calm, and hope can rewrite destiny. On the morning of July 23, 1983, the crew of Air Canada, Flight 143, prepared for what seemed like an ordinary journey from Montreal to Edmonton. The aircraft, a brand-new Boeing 767, stood gleaming under the summer sun. It was one of the first planes in Air Canada's fleet to use modern digital instruments instead of the traditional analog dials pilots had grown used to. Everything seemed fresh, new, and efficient. But hidden beneath the aircraft's shiny skin was a disaster waiting quietly, born not from a mechanical failure, but from a tiny human calculation error. Fueling for the flight had been confusing. Canada had recently transitioned to the metric system, and not everyone had fully adapted. The new Boeing 767 measured fuel in kilograms, not pounds, and the calculation charts were new, unfamiliar, and sometimes misread. Without realizing it, the team used the wrong conversion factor. They filled the tanks, but with half the fuel required, and no one noticed. The gauges inside the cockpit, meant to show the exact fuel quantity, were out of service that day. The crew relied on a manual dripstick measurement, a process they were rarely required to use. The numbers the team wrote down appeared correct, but they were in pounds, not kilograms. A tiny difference on paper, but a life-or-death difference in the sky. Flight 143 lifted off from Montreal smoothly that afternoon. The weather was calm, the skies open, and the passengers, nearly 70 souls, settled into their seats for a relaxing trip across Canada. Families chatted quietly, businessmen reviewed documents, and some simply closed their eyes, letting the soft drone of the engines lull them. Up front, Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal guided the aircraft westward. The Boeing 767 was efficient, modern, and responsive, everything a pilot could dream of. But hundreds of miles into their flight, something subtle began to happen, something impossible to detect from the cabin, something that would soon push the aircraft into one of the most legendary emergencies in aviation history. Fuel, the plane's lifeblood, was slowly draining far faster than anyone expected, and the crew believed they had plenty. Over the vast skies of Canada, the aircraft maintained a smooth cruise. Nothing seemed off, but the aircraft's central computer, the ECAS, was quietly watching. A small alarm appeared on the screen, a low fuel pressure warning. It was a tiny flicker, barely noticeable, the kind that sometimes appeared due to a sensor glitch. The pilots monitored it, but everything else read normal. The engine still hummed strongly. Altitude remained stable. No vibrations, no unusual sounds, no sense that anything catastrophic was forming. But beneath the wings, something was happening the pilots couldn't see. The left engine began receiving less fuel. Pressure dropped inside the lines. The hum of the engine remained steady, but inside, the system was starving. The warning sounded again, louder this time, more insistent. It demanded attention. Then, mid-air, something no pilot ever wants to face happened. The left engine shut down. The aircraft shuddered. The cockpit lights shifted. A faint tremor passed through the cabin. Some passengers glanced up, wondering if there was turbulence. The flight attendants looked toward the cockpit, waiting for information. But the real shock wasn't that one engine failed. It's what came next. With one engine gone, the crew began preparing for an emergency diversion. They still had a second engine. The Boeing 767 could fly safely on just one. The pilots stayed calm, running through checklists, planning to reach Winnipeg, the nearest major airport. But the moment they started moving toward the diversion plan, a second warning appeared. The right engine, the last remaining source of power, showed falling pressure. Passengers felt a strange silence, like the sky suddenly became heavier. Then, the impossible happened. The right engine shut down. Both engines gone. The Boeing 767 transformed from a roaring jetliner to a silent, powerless glider at 41,000 feet. The fans stopped spinning. The vibration of the engines faded into eerie quiet. In the cabin, that sudden silence felt unreal. People looked around, confused, anxious. The plane wasn't diving, but it wasn't climbing either. It was simply drifting. In that moment, the cockpit filled with alarm messages. Systems that depended on engine power began shutting one by one. Hydraulic pressure, electrical power, automatic controls, everything flickered uncertainly. A modern airplane designed to be powered by two massive engines had suddenly become a 132-ton glider. And yet the plane didn't fall apart. It didn't spiral. It didn't lose control. Because beneath this mechanical silence, another force awakened, a simple, brilliant system called the RAT, the ram air turbine. As the engines died, a small propeller dropped from the belly of the aircraft, spinning violently in the rushing air, generating just enough power to keep basic flight controls alive. But it wasn't enough to restart the engines. The aircraft had no thrust, no ability to climb, and almost no electrical systems. The pilots were now flying something Boeing had never expected to see. A massive passenger jet gliding through the sky like a silent bird. Passengers didn't know the details, but they felt it. The silence, the tension, the change in the aircraft's motion. Flight attendants began calming people, securing the cabin, preparing for an emergency none of them had ever trained for at this altitude. The pilots checked their remaining options. They needed an airport and they needed one fast. But they weren't close to any major runway anymore. Then First Officer Quintal remembered something, an old military airstrip. He used to train near years ago, a place that no longer hosted military flights, a runway that wasn't even an airport anymore. Just a forgotten track of concrete in Gimli, Manitoba, a place no one expected a passenger jet to land. But now that old abandoned runway was their only hope. And Flight 143 began its silent, desperate glide toward Gimli. The Boeing 767 sliced through the sky with no sound, except the rush of wind brushing against its metal skin. With both engines dead, Flight 143 had become a powerless glider, a machine built for roaring. Thrust now floated through the atmosphere, like a giant feather, falling, yet graceful in its descent. Inside the aircraft, the silence was unsettling. For passengers, that calm felt unnatural. They could sense something was wrong, though few understood the scale of the emergency unfolding. That sudden absence of vibration, the subtle nose-down angle, the cool tension in the air. It all signaled a new unfamiliar reality. In the cockpit, Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal worked with intense focus. Their instruments were limited. With engines dead, the display screens that usually showed crucial data went dark. The aircraft was now powered only by a small device, the ram air turbine, spinning wildly in the rushing wind outside. It generated just enough electricity for the most basic flight controls. Everything else was gone. The pilots now had a single mission: keep the aircraft gliding as far as possible. They quickly calculated the numbers in their heads. At their current altitude, they might be able to glide roughly 12 to 15 minutes. Maybe less. Every second mattered. Every small control input needed to be perfect. With no engines to provide thrust, any unnecessary maneuver could waste precious altitude, and they weren't heading directly toward any major airport anymore. The closest viable option was the old airstrip at Gimli, but there was a problem. Gimli was not a normal airport anymore. It was a retired Royal Canadian Air Force Base. The runway had been converted into a recreation area hosting events and races. It wasn't equipped for commercial aircraft. It wasn't meant to handle a massive Boeing 767. No control tower, no emergency crew ready, no systems designed for landings. But it was a runway, and that alone meant hope. The pilots turned toward Gimli. Without engines, the plane responded slowly, almost reluctantly. The air around the wings felt thinner, weaker. The aircraft descended steadily toward the ground, trading altitude for distance. The passengers noticed the turn, the pitch, the unusual atmosphere. But they still didn't know the invisible battle happening at the front of the plane. The temperature dropped slightly as the cabin depressurized naturally during descent. Some passengers tightened their seatbelts. Others closed their eyes, trusting fate and the people they couldn't see in the cockpit. The pilots reviewed what little they had left, a glide slope that shifted constantly, minimal instruments, and their deep experience. Captain Pearson, with a background flying gliders, understood the nuances of controlling a powerless aircraft. He could feel the weight, the balance, the attitude, a connection between pilot and machine that few ever experience. He began adjusting the glide path carefully. Every second mattered. Every foot of altitude was precious. But then came another complication. The plane was too high. Despite being powerless, the aircraft still had more altitude than needed to reach the runway. Falling short would be fatal, but overshooting would be just as deadly. The pilot searched for a solution, something that could reduce altitude quickly without losing control. Then Captain Pearson made a bold decision. He performed a forward slip, an advanced maneuver rarely used in commercial aviation. It involved banking the plane sharply while applying opposite rudder, forcing the aircraft to descend rapidly without increasing speed dangerously. It was a technique straight out of glider training, something pilots used to shed altitude in a controlled way. To an observer on the ground, the massive Boeing 767 seemed to tilt unnaturally as it dropped toward the earth. To passengers, the shift felt strange, a sudden change in balance. The aircraft descended faster, the wind noise grew louder, and the horizon tilted as if the plane was wrestling gravity itself. Inside the cockpit, the altimeter spun downward faster than usual. The pilots monitored every movement, ensuring the maneuver didn't push the aircraft into a stall. Without engines, a stall would be unrecoverable. The plane would fall, helpless. But the maneuver worked. The aircraft shed altitude rapidly while maintaining enough speed to remain stable. As they approached Gimli, another problem emerged, one far more unexpected. The runway wasn't empty. Down below, people were gathered on the old airstrip. Cars, cyclists, families, and event spectators filled parts of the runway. They weren't expecting an aircraft. They weren't watching the skies. They had no idea a silent giant was descending on them. From the cockpit, the runway came into view. The old concrete strip looked narrow, shorter than any commercial runway. It was surrounded by vehicles, tents, and people. It wasn't aligned perfectly, and it certainly wasn't smooth enough for a plane of this size. But it was all they had. The pilots continued their descent. The wind whistled louder now, vibrating through the fuselage. Passengers held onto their armrests, some praying silently, others gripping hands. The cabin crew remained strong, guiding everyone to brace, preparing them for impact despite the unknown ahead. At this point, the aircraft's landing gear became a concern. Would it extend with such limited power? Would the hydraulics respond? Only one way to find out. The gear lever was selected, and the system began to move. The nose gear locked into place. One main landing gear locked. But the other didn't. The right main landing gear failed to lock down. It hung partially extended. This meant the aircraft would touch down unevenly, scraping metal across the runway, threatening sparks, imbalance, and structural failure on landing. But with no engines, no fuel, and no second chance, the crew had no choice. They continued the glide. The abandoned airstrip grew larger in the windshield. The crowd below finally noticed something unusual in the sky, a massive aircraft descending silently. Some froze in shock. Others ran, clearing paths instinctively as the plane approached. Inside the cockpit, the pilots focused on the last few seconds. There were no engines to adjust power, no go-around procedure, no second attempt. This would be the first landing attempt, and the last. The ground rushed upward. The Boeing 767 approached Gimli's rough concrete at an angle, losing altitude fast, moving silently except for the roar of air smashing against its frame. There was no turning back. This was it. Flight 143 was seconds away from the most extraordinary landing attempt in aviation history. The final seconds of Flight 143's descent felt stretched, suspended between fear and hope. The Boeing 767 glided toward the abandoned Gimli airstrip with no engines, one landing gear stuck, and a runway filled with unsuspecting people. The aircraft cut through the warm Manitoba air like a silent shadow, descending with a grace that masked the danger waiting below. On the ground, the first spectators finally understood the reality approaching them. A massive jet, something that had no business being anywhere near this place, was dropping out of the sky without a sound. Some froze in disbelief. Others shouted and scrambled to clear the runway. Cars swerved to the side. Bicycles slid across the concrete as their riders jumped off. Children were pulled back by panicking parents. No one had time to think. The aircraft was already too close. From above, the pilots could see the chaos scatter across the strip, but it was far too late to change direction. With no thrust, no power, and altitude slipping away, the aircraft was committed. This landing would happen here, now, on a runway that wasn't meant for it. The wind roared violently against the fuselage as the aircraft approached. Ground level. Inside the cabin, passengers tightened their grip on armrests. Some closed their eyes. Others stared straight ahead, bracing for the unknown. The tension ran through the body of the aircraft like electricity. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold. For a split second, it seemed to hover, still gliding. Then gravity took over. The left main landing gear touched the concrete, and the aircraft jolted sharply. The sound of rubber hitting the hard, uneven surface echoed through the fuselage. But as the right side dipped, the stuck landing gear failed to lock into position. Metal scraped against concrete in a burst of sparks. The right side of the aircraft dragged painfully across the runway. The Boeing 767 tilted dangerously, sending a shower of glowing sparks behind it. The screech of metal on concrete filled the air, harsh, loud, unforgettable. The crowd watching scattered even further, diving for safety as the massive aircraft barreled toward them. Despite the uneven touchdown, the pilots fought to keep the aircraft straight. With no engines, they had no thrust reversers. With compromised hydraulics, they had limited braking. The aircraft was a 100-ton beast struggling to stop on a runway that was never meant to hold it. But the pilots didn't give up. They used every ounce of remaining control to steady the aircraft. The nose touched down next, hitting the ground harder than normal, but holding firm. The nose wheel groaned under the weight as it made contact with the rough surface. Then a new crisis erupted. A guardrail, left over from a past racing event, sat across the runway. The pilots couldn't avoid it. The aircraft rolled straight into it. The metal rail tore into the bottom of the nose, ripping through structure and sending a jolt through the entire fuselage. Dust and debris blasted upward, clouding the front windows. Passengers gasped as the aircraft's front section lifted slightly, the metal groaning under the sudden impact. But despite the violent hit, the nose gear didn't collapse completely. The aircraft continued forward, slowing but still moving with immense force. The sparks eventually began to fade. The scraping metal softened. The Boeing 767's speed dropped rapidly as the rough pavement and emergency braking fought against momentum. Smoke rose from the left landing gear. Dust trailed behind the aircraft like a comet tail. The runway blurred past the windows. And then, in a final drawn-out roll, the aircraft came to a stop. Silence. For a moment, the entire world seemed frozen. The engines were already dead, so nothing shut down. No vibration faded away. There was simply stillness. Stillness after chaos, quiet after terror. Inside the cabin, the passengers opened their eyes slowly, as if unsure whether the nightmare had ended or merely paused. Some began to sob. Others stared in disbelief, their minds struggling to understand the miracle they had just survived. Flight attendants steadied themselves and immediately moved to guide passengers, preparing for a possible evacuation. Outside, dust drifted around the aircraft. People from the ground event cautiously approached, stunned by what they had just witnessed. A massive commercial jet, an aircraft, that should have crashed miles before reaching this place, had somehow landed, without a single drop of fuel. But the danger wasn't over yet. Inside the wings, fuel lines still held vapor. With metal scraping the runway, sparks had flown dangerously close. Everyone feared the possibility of fire. The cabin crew acted quickly, opening emergency exits to evacuate the passengers before anything could ignite. The slides deployed, billowing into shape. Passengers exited carefully, sliding down one by one, some limping, some clutching bags or shoes. But they were alive. Every single one of them. People landed on the grass, stunned but safe, gathering in small, trembling circles. Rescue teams from nearby towns rushed in after receiving emergency calls. But when they arrived, they found something extraordinary. Not the aftermath of a disaster, but the survivors of a miracle. The aircraft, despite the intense damage, remained largely intact. No explosion, no fire, no catastrophic breakup. It stood resting awkwardly on the runway, leaning slightly to one side, metal scorched and scraped but whole. In the cockpit, the pilots finally exhaled. The ordeal was over. The aircraft had stopped. They had made it. But as the dust settled, another realization dawned. They had just accomplished something no one believed was possible, landing a massive Boeing 767 with zero engine power, one landing gear missing, and a runway filled with obstacles, and walking away with all lives saved. A feat so rare, so difficult, that aviation experts would later call it one of the greatest landings in the history of flight. Yet in that moment, standing under the open sky on that abandoned strip of concrete. The crew and passengers of Flight 143 felt only one thing: hope, pure, undeniable hope, that turned a tragedy into a miracle. And the world had not yet learned the full truth of what caused this near disaster because the investigation was just beginning. The final passenger slid down the emergency slide and landed on the tarmac, shaken but alive. For a moment, the world seemed suspended, every heartbeat echoing in the silence after the chaos. Smoke still curled from parts of the cabin. Emergency lights flickered faintly, and the faint scent of burnt circuitry lingered in the air. But the passengers were safe. Every single life accounted for. Outside the aircraft, relief and disbelief mixed in a strange cocktail of emotion. Families embraced on the grass, their hands trembling, faces pale yet glowing with the miraculous reality. They were alive. Children clung to parents, wide-eyed, some still uncertain if the ordeal was truly over. Every individual bore the imprint of fear transformed into relief, a shared memory that would last a lifetime. The flight attendant remained at the door of the aircraft, scanning the tarmac to ensure no one was left behind. Her uniform was dusty, slightly smudged, and her hair tousled from the hurried evacuation. But she stood tall, calm, and composed, a pillar amid the chaos. Every motion she had made in the last 9 minutes had been deliberate, a choreography of survival that had turned potential disaster into a story of courage. Emergency responders finally arrived. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles surrounded the airplane, their lights flashing and sirens piercing the quiet relief of the scene. But as they approached, it became clear there were no casualties. No lives had been lost. The responders looked around in astonishment at the efficiency and composure of the evacuation, noting the calm authority that had guided hundreds of people to safety. The passengers were escorted away from the aircraft. Blankets and water offered, while officials documented the scene. But the focus remained on the flight attendant, whose actions had orchestrated the entire evacuation. Her calm demeanor had turned fear into order, panic into structured movement, and potential tragedy into miraculous survival. In the quiet moments that followed, passengers began to recount their experiences, still in shock. They spoke of the silence of the aircraft after the engines failed, the sudden appearance of smoke, and the astonishing calm of the flight attendant who had become the center of gravity in their panic. Their words painted a portrait of a woman whose quick thinking and courage had been the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, investigators and airline officials began to piece together the sequence of events that had led to the emergency. Preliminary reports revealed a mechanical issue had triggered alarms, but the rapid spread of smoke and the risk it posed made immediate evacuation essential. Yet the story that stood out was not the mechanical failure. It was the human response. The flight attendant had made a split-second decision to initiate evacuation, understanding the danger before anyone else, and her authority had guided hundreds of passengers to safety in record time. The emergency slides were inspected, the aircraft examined, and debris cleared from the tarmac. All technical aspects would be analyzed in detail later, but the human story had already captured global attention. News cameras captured images of passengers safe on the grass, and the silhouette of the flight attendant standing by the aircraft became an iconic symbol of courage under pressure. Even as the scene settled, her impact remained. Passengers would later describe the feeling of calm she inspired, how her gestures and commands created a rhythm in the chaos, and how her presence alone made fear manageable. Psychologists would later note that in moments of extreme stress, a single authoritative and calm figure can dramatically influence survival rates, and this flight had exemplified that principle perfectly. In the days that followed, airline executives and aviation authorities recognized the heroism displayed on that flight. The flight attendant was praised, not just for following protocol, but for exceeding it, taking initiative, reading the situation with unmatched clarity, and executing a flawless evacuation under extreme pressure. Interviews, awards, and media coverage celebrated her courage. But for those who had been in the cabin, her presence was less about recognition and more about life itself. For the passengers, the memory of those 9 minutes would be forever etched. They remembered the sudden alarm, the swirl of smoke, the tension of the unknown, and above all, the calm authority of a woman whose courage turned a potential tragedy into a miracle. Every passenger had felt it, the reassurance, the direction, the silent promise that if they followed her lead, they would survive. And survive they did. The story spread quickly beyond the airline, reaching aviation enthusiasts, emergency responders, and the general public. It became a case study in crisis management, human decision-making under pressure, and the profound impact a single individual can have in moments of extreme danger. For many, it was a reminder that heroism is not always defined by size or status, but by presence, courage, and the ability to act decisively when every second counts. Months later, the flight attendant would quietly reflect on the experience. She had done what she was trained to do, but she also acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the moment. 9 minutes. Just 9 minutes had tested every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage she possessed. And those 9 minutes had saved hundreds of lives. The passengers, meanwhile, would forever remember that day as the moment they were guided from fear to safety. Their gratitude was unending, their admiration unwavering. In interviews and personal accounts, many described the flight attendant as more than a professional. She was a guardian, a calm presence in the eye of a storm, the difference between despair and survival. In the end, Flight 143 became a story of hope, courage, and the extraordinary impact of one human being in the face of danger. It was a story that would inspire generations, reminding the world that even in moments of uncertainty and fear, calm, decisive action can save lives. The flight attendant had transformed an ordinary day into a tale of heroism, proving that true courage is measured not in words, but in actions that protect and preserve life. And though the engines had failed, the fear had lifted, and the passengers walked away alive. One thing was certain: the hero of that flight would never be forgotten.